Caleb Vance was the most ruthless crime lord in Chicago, the man the entire city feared. For 20 years, since the day his father took his last breath in his arms, Caleb had buried his enemies without firing a single shot, forcing even the most cold-blooded criminals to bow their heads. People called him the Ghost because anyone who displeased him vanished into thin air. Then one night, everything changed. When Caleb stepped into his private office inside the estate, he heard a strange sound drifting from the vault room within, the room protected by biometric security that only he could open. A tiny cooing sound like a child. Caleb drew his gun and moved toward the door that stood slightly ajar. He was prepared for anything, an enemy, a hitter, even a bomb, but when he pushed the door open, he went perfectly still. A baby. The little girl was sitting in the center of the floor, her small hand playing with a loose thread in the carpet. Her blonde hair softly curled under the light, and when she lifted her face and saw him, she didn't cry. She didn't fear him. She gave him the brightest smile, then crawled toward him, her tiny arms reaching out as if she'd been waiting for him her whole life. In that instant, everything Caleb had ever believed about his brutal world collapsed completely because that baby appeared at the exact moment his empire was on the edge. A $10 million deal had just fallen apart, a rat was lurking in the shadows, and the feds were tightening the noose. But was it really just coincidence? Or had someone deliberately left that door open? And why, out of everyone in the world, did the baby choose to crawl toward the most ruthless kingpin in Chicago, then wrap her little fingers around his and refuse to let go? Caleb stood frozen like a stone statue in the vault room no one had dared enter for the past 20 years except him. The mind that had always been razor-sharp, the mind that had calculated hundreds of life and death deals now stopped working completely. The gun in his hand suddenly felt strangely heavy, strangely meaningless. He looked down at the baby sitting in the middle of the floor, grinning wide, drool soaking the pale pink bib, and then he looked at the glossy black gun in his own hand. A short mocking laugh slipped out of Caleb's throat, a sound he didn't even recognize as his. It was absurd to the point of being unreal that the Ghost, the man who made Chicago's underworld tremble, had drawn a weapon on a creature not yet a year old. Slowly, he lowered the gun, slid it back into the leather holster at his side, and kept his eyes on the baby the entire time. The little one didn't seem to know fear at all. She kept crawling toward him, tiny palms patting the Persian rug, a rug worth $100,000 that he had ordered after an auction in London. Caleb stood there, tall and threatening in a custom-tailored black suit worth $30,000, and yet he was completely powerless against this small creature. He didn't know what to do. When was the last time he had felt this kind of confusion? Maybe 20 years ago when his father, Frank Vance, had breathed his last in Caleb's arms and whispered, "You have to be strong, Caleb. This empire is yours." But now, facing this baby, all that strength dissolved into nothing. The child crawled to his feet and looked up with round, clear eyes like two jewels. She reached out, her tiny fingers trying to grab the leg of his trousers. Caleb let out a long breath, then did something he had never done in all his 42 years of life. He sat down on the floor, his $30,000 suit touched the rug, and he didn't care anymore. He sat cross-legged like a child, facing the small creature staring at him with pure curiosity. "Who are you?" Caleb asked, his voice low and rough. "How did you get in here?" The baby didn't answer. Of course she didn't. She just smiled, making meaningless cooing sounds, then turned to play with the rug. Her tiny fingers found a loose thread along the edge and began to pull. Caleb watched her tug and tug until a long strip, as long as his hand, tore free from the ancient rug. He should have been angry. He should have called security and found out who had let a baby slip into this place. But instead, he only sat there, silent, watching. The baby snapped the thread, then looked at him with a triumphant little face. She held it out towards Caleb, making an aha sound as if she were offering him something priceless. "You just ruined my $100,000 rug," Caleb said, and there wasn't a trace of anger in his voice. "Do you know that?" The baby laughed, drool sliding down her chin. "You don't know." Caleb sighed. "Of course you don't know." He reached out to take the thread from her hand, but she pulled back quickly, hugging her trophy to her chest. Then, without warning, she crawled straight into Caleb's lap and settled there like she belonged. Caleb went rigid. He didn't know where to put his hands. He didn't know what to do. The baby wiggled against him, then reached up, her tiny fingers closing around his index finger. She held tight, so tight Caleb could feel each small joint squeezing him, and she wouldn't let go. He tried to free his hand, but the baby clutched harder, making a small protesting sound like she was about to cry. All right, Caleb surrendered. "I'm not going anywhere." He sat there, letting her hold his finger, feeling the small warmth of her body seep into him. How long had it been since he had touched a living thing without meaning to cause pain? How long had it been since he had felt this kind of absolute trust from anyone? Then he smelled it. A terrible smell, thick and overpowering, hit his nose like a punch. Caleb grimaced, trying not to breathe. The baby kept grinning, completely unaware she had just created a biological disaster inside her diaper. "What the hell?" Caleb choked out. "What did you just do?" The baby laughed even harder, as if she were proud of her achievement. Caleb, who had faced the coldest killers, who had stepped over corpses without blinking, was now utterly helpless in front of a dirty diaper. He lifted the baby up, holding her as far away from his body as he could, but she still clung to his finger and refused to let go. "I've killed 50 people," Caleb muttered, staring at her with total helplessness. "I built an empire from nothing. I make all of Chicago afraid. But this..." He glanced at the diaper, releasing its deadly perfume. "This I don't know how to handle." The baby looked at him, tilted her head as if she were trying to understand, then laughed again, a laugh that was innocent, bright, untouched by fear. And Caleb realized that for the first time in many years, he didn't know what he was supposed to do next. The door to the vault room slammed open with a violent bang. Caleb whipped around, the killer's instinct surging up, his hand already on the grip of his gun. But the person who burst in wasn't an enemy or a hitter. It was a young woman, her face drained white with fear. She rushed in like a storm, her brown hair tied messily at the nape of her neck, coming loose. Damp strands stuck to her sweats-like forehead. Her light gray cleaning uniform was wrinkled as if she'd run through the entire building to get here. "Daisy," she cried, the name tearing out of her throat, and her green eyes swept the room until they locked on the baby in Caleb's arms. Then she realized who was holding her child. She went still, as if someone had dumped a bucket of ice water over her head. Her already pale face turned even paler. Caleb could see her trembling, her whole body shaking like a leaf caught in a storm. Her lips moved, but no words came. He knew that look. He'd seen it hundreds of times on the faces of people who met him at the edge of life and death. It was pure terror, the kind that made a person want to drop to their knees and beg. But this woman didn't kneel. She stood there with her back straight and her chin slightly lifted. Even though her legs shook so badly, Caleb could see her knees threatening to buckle. She swallowed, drew a deep breath, then looked straight into his eyes. Those green eyes still held fear, but inside them was something else, too. A small flame, weak, but refusing to go out. Caleb was surprised. Truly surprised. For years, he'd been used to people collapsing at his feet, pleading, crying, begging for mercy, but this thin woman in a cheap cleaning uniform wouldn't kneel. "You know who I am," Caleb said. Not a question, but a statement. "Yes," she answered, her voice shaking, but steady enough to reach him. "Mr. Vance." "Then why aren't you kneeling?" Silence stretched between them. In Caleb's arms, the baby began to squirm, reaching toward the woman, making a soft mama-ma sound with no clear meaning. The woman looked at her child, her gaze softening for a heartbeat. Then she looked back at Caleb. "I only kneel before God," she said, her voice still trembling, but each word clear. "Not before anyone else, no matter who they are." Caleb stared at her for a long moment. Then something strange slipped from his throat. A quiet, brief laugh, like wind lost in a crack in the door. He couldn't remember the last time he'd left. Maybe before his father died nearly 20 years ago. The sound was so unfamiliar it startled him, too. "Interesting," he said. "What's your name?" "Sarah. Sarah Miller." "Is this baby yours?" "Yes, Daisy. Daisy Marie Miller." "She's 8 months old," Sarah said quickly, her voice breaking with worry. I'm sorry she got in here. I don't know how she could. I only left her in the stroller for a moment to mop the hallway. I didn't see Nina slipping out of your private wing, leaving the heavy security door slightly ajar. By the time I turned around, Daisy had spotted the open door and crawled inside, lured by the silence of the vault room. I searched everywhere. You brought your baby to work," Caleb cut in, his voice giving nothing away. Sarah hesitated. She knew it was a serious violation. Staff weren't allowed to bring family, especially children, into this building. It was the kind of rule everyone knew. "My sitter got sick," she said softly. "I don't have anyone else. I can't miss work because I need the money. I'm sorry. I know it's wrong. Please don't fire me. I'll do anything. How long have you worked here?" "For months, sir." Caleb nodded, his eyes dropping to the baby squirming in his arms. Daisy Marie Miller, 8 months old. She still had his index finger in her grip, and she wouldn't let go, and the smell from her diaper was still there, thick and horrifying. "She needs a diaper change," he said. Sarah looked as if she'd been jolted awake. She stepped forward, reaching out to take her daughter. Yes, let me, Daisy. Come to Mommy." But the moment Sarah's hands touched Daisy, the baby suddenly screamed. Not of a small, fussy cry, but a sharp, ear-splitting wail, like someone was trying to tear her away from the most important thing in the world. Daisy clung to Caleb's suit jacket, her tiny fingers gripping the fabric as if her life depended on it. Tears streamed down her small face, and the crying only grew louder. Sarah froze. She stared at her daughter, unable to believe what she was seeing. Daisy, the baby who only slept when her mother held her, the baby who screamed whenever a stranger picked her up, was now clinging to the city's most feared sovereign, as if he were the person she loved most. "Daisy," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "Baby, come to Mommy. Mommy's here." But Daisy only cried harder, her face turning red, her grip tightening on Caleb. Caleb looked down at the baby, then at the mother standing in front of him, confused and desperate. He saw tears gathering in her green eyes. He saw her thin shoulders trembling. He saw exhaustion and worry carved into the fragile yet stubbornly brave face. And he made a decision he didn't understand himself. "Leave her here," Caleb said, his voice low and final. "Go back to work." Sarah's eyes widened, disbelief written across her face. But sir, I don't repeat myself," Caleb cut her off. "She'll stay here until you're done. And you." He paused, looking at her with an unreadable gaze. "You owe me an explanation for how she got into this room, but that's later. Right now, go to your job." Sarah's knuckles turned white. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to claw her baby back from the monster in the $30,000 suit. But the gun on his desk was real, and her poverty was real. She swallowed the scream building in her throat, looking at Daisy one last time like she was saying goodbye forever. "Yes, sir," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. She turned and fled before she could break down. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, sealing her heart inside a vault of gold and blood. The door clicked shut, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Caleb was alone. The most dangerous man in Chicago was left standing in his vault with a crying baby and a smell that could peel paint off the walls. Daisy squirmed against his chest, her little face scrunched up in discomfort, and let out a fresh wail that pierced straight through his eardrums. Caleb Vance, who had negotiated with cartels and dismantled rival gangs without breaking a sweat, felt a bead of cold sweat slide down his temple. He looked at the baby, then at the empty room. There were no diapers here. There were no wipes. There was only stacks of cash, gold bars, and weapons. "Okay," Caleb whispered, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. "We improvise." He carried her to the large mahogany desk, clearing away a stack of confidential files with one sweep of his arm. He laid Daisy down on the smooth wood, her back resting on a leather blotter worth $2,000. She kicked her legs, fussing, her diaper sagging heavily. Caleb grimaced. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief, a pure white square of Italian silk he kept for appearances. He looked at it, then at the disaster waiting inside the diaper. "This is going to be expensive," he muttered. He grabbed the crystal pitcher of water from the side table, the one he used for whiskey, and poured a little onto the silk. With hands that had broken bones and pulled triggers, he began to clean an 8-month-old baby. His movements were stiff, awkward, terrified of hurting her, terrified of the mess, terrified of the sheer absurdity of his life in this moment. 20 minutes later, the crisis was managed, though not solved. Daisy was wrapped in a clean, albeit ruined, silk handkerchief, held in place by a strip of duct tape he'd found in an emergency kit. She was clean, she was dry, and miraculously, she was smiling again. Caleb slumped back in his leather chair, exhausted in a way he hadn't been after 12-hour standoffs. He looked at the baby cooing on his desk, playing with a gold pen, and let out a long breath. Then the cold reality of his world came rushing back. He pressed the intercom button on his desk. "Mike," he said, his voice instantly hardening into the tone of command. "Get in here, and pull the security feed for the East Wing hallway." A moment later, Big Mike, his head of security and a man the size of a vending machine, walked in. He stopped dead when he saw the baby on the desk. His jaw dropped, his eyes bulging. "Voss?" Mike asked, his voice cracking. "Is that a kid?" "Pull the feed, Mike," Caleb ordered, ignoring the question. Mike blinked, then quickly moved to the wall of monitors, typing in a code. The screen flickered to life, showing the grainy black and white footage of the hallway outside the office. Caleb watched the screen. Sarah Miller was there. She was on her hands and knees, scrubbing the marble floor. Her movements were jerky, frantic. He could see her shoulders shaking. He could see her wiping her eyes with the back of her hand every few seconds. She was terrified. She was weeping. But she was working. She didn't run. She didn't call the police. She didn't hide in a closet. She scrubbed the floor with a ferocity that spoke of desperation, of a woman who had absolutely no other choice. Caleb watched her for a long time, the silence of the room broken only by Daisy's soft babbling. He had seen men twice her size beg for their lives. He had seen hardened criminals piss themselves when he walked into a room. But this girl, this skinny widow with nothing to her name, had looked him in the eye and refused to kneel. "She's got grit," Mike muttered, watching the same feed. "Most people would be halfway to the state line by now." "She has a hostage," Caleb said quietly, his eyes drifting back to the baby. Daisy had grown bored with the pen and was now reaching for him again, her little hands opening and closing. Caleb picked her up, settling her against his chest. She sighed, a small, contented sound, and rested her head on his shoulder. Her breathing slowed. Her eyes drooped. Within seconds, she was asleep. The weight of her sleeping body on his chest felt heavy, grounding, terrifyingly real. Caleb sat there in the dim light of the monitors, one hand absent-mindedly rubbing the baby's back, his mind racing. He looked past the monitors to the heavy steel door of the vault. The door that had been left ajar. The door that required a biometric scan to open. His prints were in the system. And there was only one other person who had access. One person he trusted enough to override the system for emergency cash drops. Mina, his secretary, his right hand for 5 years. Caleb's eyes narrowed, the warmth of the baby contrasting sharply with the ice forming in his gut. A $10 million deal collapsed. A rat in the organization. And now, a breach in his inner sanctum. It wasn't an accident. Sarah Miller might be an innocent pawn, a mother making a mistake, but the door was a message. Or a trap. Someone had left it open. Someone wanted him exposed. Or maybe someone had gotten sloppy. Caleb looked down at Daisy, her blonde curls tickling his chin. She was safe here for now. But outside that door, the wolves were circling, and one of them might be sleeping in the office right next door. The next morning felt like a funeral march for Sarah Miller as she stood in the servants' quarters, clutching Daisy to her chest and waiting for the inevitable end. She had spent the terrifying night expecting the police or men with guns to drag her away to the marshes, but instead of a hitman, Big Mike appeared at her door at 8 a.m. sharp. He didn't pull a weapon and he didn't shout, simply nodding toward the elevator and stating that the boss wanted to see her immediately. The ride up to the penthouse was silent and suffocating, the polished brass doors reflecting a woman worn thin by grief and exhaustion holding a baby who didn't understand that her mother was walking to her execution. The doors slid open to reveal the sprawling office where she had left her child the night before, and Caleb Vance was sitting behind his desk looking immaculate in a charcoal suit, though Sarah noticed the dark, heavy circles under his eyes that made him look less like a monster and more like a man who hadn't slept in a decade. Sarah stepped forward with her legs trembling, preparing to drop to her knees and beg for her life. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words catching in her dry throat. "I'll pack my things. I'll leave right now. Please just let us go." Caleb didn't look up from his papers and didn't acknowledge her fear. He slid a single sheet of heavy cream-colored stationery across the mahogany desk, and Sarah realized with a jolt that it wasn't a termination notice or a death warrant, but a schedule. Sarah blinked, confused, her eyes scanning the list of times and duties that outlined a bizarre new reality. "You're not fired," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold. "You're promoted." He explained the terms with the detachment of a business deal, stating she was to clean his private quarters and specifically this office only when the baby was awake. He needed eyes on the child, and he needed the room clean, and apparently, he didn't trust anyone else to do it. Sarah felt a wave of dizziness and asked why, the word escaping before she could stop it. Caleb finally looked at her, his black eyes unreadable. "Because you didn't run," he answered. "And because my security system seems to like you." Sarah clutched the paper, her knuckles turning white, feeling a desperate need to explain herself so he would know she wasn't a threat to his empire. "My husband died a year ago," she said, the confession spilling out fast and desperate. "Mark. He was a good man. He died in a car accident, and the debts. They took everything. The house. The savings. I had nowhere else to go." She waited for sympathy, for a flicker of kindness in the eyes of the man who held her fate, but Caleb's face remained made of stone. He didn't care about her tragedy because in his world, tragedy was just another Tuesday. "I don't need your life story, Sarah," he cut her off, his voice sharp enough to draw blood. "I need silence. Keep the kid quiet. Keep the room clean. Do that, and you get paid triple your current rate. Mess up, and you're gone." He turned back to his files, dismissing her, but Sarah saw his hand twitch on the desk, a small, involuntary sign that her words had landed somewhere deep behind his armor. The arrangement sent shockwaves through the estate, specifically hitting Mina, Caleb's personal secretary, who prided herself on being the only woman allowed in the inner sanctum. Mina marched into the office an hour later, a stunning brunette with a sharp tongue, ready to discuss the new shipment of Glocks coming from the harbor, but Caleb stopped her with a raised hand. "I need you to make an order," he said, handing her a list that made her perfectly manicured eyebrows shoot up. It wasn't a list of weapons or burner phones, but a list of high-end baby supplies, including a Swedish crib made of organic oak priced at $5,000, formula imported from Germany, and plush toys that cost more than a used car. "Is this a joke?" Nina asked, her voice tight with disbelief. "Do I look like I'm joking?" Caleb replied, not even glancing at her. Nina turned her glare on Sarah, who was dusting the bookshelves in the corner with Daisy strapped to her chest, and the look was pure poison. It was the look of a woman who realized she was being replaced, not in the boardroom, but in a space she hadn't even realized she wanted until now. The tension in the house was thick enough to choke on, but outside the estate, the real danger was mobilizing with lethal precision. Just past noon, the red phone on Caleb's desk rang, a secure line used only for emergencies that made everyone in the room freeze. Caleb answered, listened for 10 seconds, and then slammed the receiver down so hard the plastic housing cracked. "They hit the south warehouse," he told Big Mike, his voice a low growl that vibrated through the room. "The Falcones. They knew the shift rotation. They knew the route." The color drained from Mike's face because it wasn't just a raid. It was a message that meant the leak wasn't just a drip, it was a flood. Someone inside the inner circle was feeding them to the wolves. Caleb stood up and walked to the window that overlooked the estate grounds, making a decision that would seal all their fates. "Lock it down," he ordered. "Full perimeter seal. No one comes in. No one goes out. Not the staff. Not the guards. And definitely not the cleaner." Sarah looked up from her work, fear spiking in her chest as the electronic shutters began to descend over the windows. She was trapped in a golden cage with a man who was being hunted, holding a baby who thought this dangerous world was a playground. Big Mike walked into the office with a manila folder thick enough to choke a horse, his face grim as he set it down on the mahogany desk right next to a silver rattle that looked ridiculously out of place. "Sarah Miller," Mike grunted, tapping the file with a thick finger. "Widow, 26. Husband was Mark Miller, died 11 months ago on I-90. Caleb picked up the file, his eyes scanning the official police report that painted a picture of a reckless drunk who destroyed his family. Drunk driving, high speed, crossed the median, head-on collision with a barrier. Blood alcohol level twice the legal limit. It was a standard tragedy, the kind that happened every day in a city that ran on vice and misery. But then Caleb turned the page to the financial records, and his eyebrows knit together. Mark Miller owed $1.5 million to a loan shark operation out of Gary, Indiana. A forensic accountant with a perfect credit score suddenly racking up gambling debts and driving drunk? It didn't fit. The math was wrong, and Caleb Vance never missed a calculation error. He flipped to the autopsy report, ignoring the gruesome photos of the crash to focus on the toxicology screen and the medical history attached at the back. There it was, buried in the fine print of a medical history form from 3 years ago, a detail the corrupt cops had been too lazy to scrub. Severe ethanol allergy, the report read. Risk of anaphylaxis. Caleb stared at the words, his blood turning cold as the pieces clicked into a terrifying picture. Mark Miller hadn't been drunk because one beer would have closed his throat before he could start the car. He had been injected, staged, and murdered. "Get her in here," Caleb ordered, his voice low and dangerous, causing Big Mike to straighten up. "Now." Mike nodded and left, returning moments later with Sarah, who looked like she was walking to the gallows again. She was carrying Daisy, who was happily chewing on the ear of a plush bear that cost more than Sarah's rent used to be. Sarah set the baby down on the rug, her hands shaking as she smoothed her apron, her eyes starting to the file on the desk. She knew what was in there. She knew the lies the world believed about her husband. But she didn't know that Caleb Vance was the one man in Chicago who knew how to spot a frame job because he had commissioned enough of them himself. "Sit," Caleb commanded, pointing to the leather chair opposite him. Sarah sat on the edge, ready to bolt, her eyes wide with fear. Caleb didn't waste time with pleasantries. He spun the file around and pointed to the medical report. Your husband was allergic to alcohol, he stated, watching her face closely. So how did he die with a 0.2 blood alcohol level? Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, tears instantly springing to her eyes. The police said he started drinking because of the debt, she whispered, her voice trembling. But I knew he never drank. He couldn't. Who is they, Sarah? Caleb asked, leaning forward, his predator's gaze locking onto her. Who did Mark owe money to? Sarah looked at Daisy playing on the floor, then back at Caleb, and a dam seemed to break inside her. He didn't owe anyone, she cried, the injustice of a year pouring out. Mark was a forensic accountant. He found things, irregularities. 3 days before he died, some men came to our house. They wore suits. They told him to sign off on some accounts to hide money in shell companies. He refused. He told them to get out. 3 days later, he was dead. What were the companies? Caleb asked, his voice soft now, almost gentle, a trap faded with empathy. Sarah wiped her eyes, trying to recall the nightmare that had ruined her life. Something. Blue Harvest? And Ironclad Logistics. The names hit Caleb like a physical blow. Ironclad Logistics was a shell company owned by the Falcone family, used to launder money from their human trafficking ring. Blue Harvest was their front for moving narcotics. Mark Miller hadn't just stumbled onto a bad audit. He had found the Falcone's dirty laundry, and he had been honorable enough to say no. He was a civilian casualty in the war Caleb had been fighting for a decade. The realization settled over Caleb like a heavy coat. This woman wasn't just a random cleaner. Her husband had been murdered by the same people trying to kill Caleb now. They killed him, Caleb said, and it wasn't a question. The Falcones killed him because he had a spine. Sarah looked up, confusion warring with her grief. Falcone, she repeated. Do you know them? Caleb stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city that was a chessboard of blood and money. I know them, he said, his voice dropping to a vow. And I'm going to make sure they regret the day they ever touched your family. Daisy gurgled from the floor, oblivious that her father's death had just become the fuel for the most dangerous war Chicago had ever seen. The afternoon sun sliced through the bulletproof glass of Caleb's office, illuminating a battle of wills that was far more intense than any cartel negotiation he had ever led. Sarah sat on the leather sofa holding a bowl of organic spinach porridge that smelled like wet grass, trying desperately to convince Daisy to open her mouth. The baby was having none of it, clamping her lips shut like a vault door and turning her head away with a stubbornness that was terrifyingly familiar. Caleb watched from his desk, tapping a gold pen against a stack of extradition treaties, his patience wearing thin not at the baby, but at the lack of efficiency. Give it to me, he finally snapped, standing up and smoothing his $30,000 custom charcoal suit. You're asking her. You need to tell her. Sarah hesitated, holding the spoon like a weapon, but she handed the bowl over when Caleb loomed over them. He took the spoon, sat on the edge of the coffee table, and looked the 8-month-old dead in the eye. Listen to me, kid, he said, his voice dropping to the low, gravelly tone that made grown men weep. You eat the green goop, or I cancel the order for the plush giraffes. Capiche? Daisy stared at him, her blue eyes wide, mesmerized by the dark intensity of the man who rolled Chicago. She opened her mouth. Caleb smirked, triumphant, and moved the spoon forward. Too easy, he muttered. And that was the exact moment Daisy decided to sneeze. It wasn't a small sneeze, it was an explosion of green sludge that sprayed across the room with the force of a biological weapon. The porridge hit Caleb square in the chest, plastering his silk-tied his shirt and splattering across his cheek like war paint. He froze, the spoon hovering in midair, looking down at the ruin of his Italian wool suit with an expression of pure shock. The room went silent, so silent you could hear the hum of the hard drives in the server rack. Sarah stopped breathing, her hands flying to her mouth, terrified that he would explode, that the monster would finally come out. But then, A sound escaped her throat that she hadn't heard in over a year. A laugh. It bubbled up from her chest, frantic and hysterical at first, then turning into a genuine, bell-clear sound of amusement that filled the cold, sterile office. She laughed until tears pricked her eyes, laughed at the absurdity of the ghost covered in spinach. Caleb slowly wiped the goop from his cheek, looked at the giggling baby, then looked at Sarah. He should have been furious. He should have been terrifying. Instead, the corner of his mouth twitched. Then it lifted, and for the first time in 20 years, Caleb Vance smiled. It wasn't the cold smirk of a killer, but a real smile that reached his eyes and softened the hard lines of his face. "All right," he said, tossing the spoon into the bowl. "You win this round, kid. But the dry cleaning bill is coming out of your allowance." That night, the atmosphere in the office had shifted from a command center to something dangerously close to a home. Daisy was asleep in the crib Nina had grudgingly set up in the corner, clutching the expensive bear Caleb had bought. Outside, the rain lashed against the skyscrapers of Chicago, turning the city into a blur of neon and gray. Sarah was wiping down the bookshelves, moving quietly, but she could feel Caleb watching her from his desk. He wasn't working. He was holding a glass of amber whiskey, staring at his reflection in the dark window. "My father used to say that affection was a rusted nail," Caleb said suddenly, his voice low, cutting through the silence. "He said if you stepped on it, the infection would kill you slower than a bullet." Sarah stopped cleaning, turning to face him. She saw the loneliness radiating off him in waves. "He was wrong," she said softly. "He was a king," Caleb replied, taking a sip of the burning liquid. "Frank Vance. He built this city on fear. He taught me that if people love you, they can hurt you. If they fear you, they obey you. I've spent my whole life being the ghost, Sarah. Invisible. Untouchable." He turned the glass in his hand, the light catching the crystal. "But ghosts get cold," Sarah whispered, stepping closer to the desk, her fear of him completely gone, replaced by a deep, aching sadness for the boy who had been raised to be a weapon. "And ghosts are alone. You don't have to be him, Caleb." He looked up at her, and for a moment, the barrier between them dissolved. He wasn't the boss, and she wasn't the maid. They were just two broken people standing in a tower, recognizing the cracks in each other's armor. The heavy oak doors slammed open with a violence that shattered the moment into a million pieces. Rocco marched in, water dripping from his leather trench coat, his face twisted in a snarl of impatience. He brought the smell of the streets with him, gasoline and rain and old blood. "We need to hit back," Rocco barked, ignoring Sarah as if she were furniture. "The Falcones took the South Warehouse. We need to burn their distribution center in Cicero tonight. I have the men ready." Caleb's face instantly hardened, the vulnerability vanishing behind the mask of the ghost. He set his whiskey down, his eyes turning to ice. "We wait," Caleb said, his voice flat. "We don't strike until we know who the leak is." Rocco slammed his hand on the desk, leaning in close, his eyes darting to the crib in the corner where Daisy stirred, then to Sarah standing by the bookshelf. A sneer curled his lip, ugly and knowing. "You're going soft, boss," Rocco spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You're sitting up here playing daddy with the help while our empire bleeds out." He straightened up, adjusting his coat, his hand lingering near his holster. "Careful, Caleb. Kings don't play house. They die in them." Rocco turned and stormed out, leaving the door swinging in his wake. The threat hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating. Caleb looked at Sarah, his eyes now completely cold, the wall back up and higher than before. "Go to your room," he ordered, and there was no kindness left in his voice. "And take the kid. This isn't a nursery anymore." The air in the boardroom was thick enough to choke a man, heavy with cigar smoke and the metallic tang of impending violence. 12 men sat around the polished obsidian table, the inner circle of the Vance Empire, divided down the middle like a cracked mirror. Rocco stood at the far end, his face flushed with the heat of his pitch, slapping a red folder onto the table that contained the blueprints for a partnership with the Baja cartel. Synthetics, Rocco growled, his voice vibrating with greed. Low cost, high yield. We flood the streets by winter, and we triple our net worth. The Falcones won't be able to touch us because we'll have an army funded by junkies. Vance, the oldest and calmest lieutenant, shook his head and pushed a white folder forward. It's blood money, Rocco. It brings heat. The feds are already watching. We pivot to tech, real estate, logistics. It's slower, but it's clean. It's a legacy we can actually survive. Caleb sat at the head of the table, silent as a grave, his eyes flicking between the red folder of war and the white folder of peace, knowing that whichever path he chose would determine who died next. The argument was reaching a fever pitch, hands drifting toward holsters, when the heavy double doors creaked open. Every head snapped around. Every hand went for a weapon. The click of safeties disengaging echoed like hail on a tin roof. But instead of a hit team kicking down the door, a tiny figure waddled into the room, holding a slobbery plush giraffe by the neck. Daisy. She had escaped Sarah's watch in the hallway, moving with the stealth only a toddler possesses. She stopped in the middle of the room, blinked at the 12 armed men staring at her, and let out a loud, happy squeal. Down! Caleb roared, but he wasn't talking to the baby. He was talking to his men. Put the guns away. Now. The men froze, confusion warring with instinct, slowly lowering their weapons as Sarah burst into the room a second later, her face pale with terror. I'm sorry, she gasped, rushing forward to grab the child. She ran. I'm so sorry. Leave her, Caleb ordered, his voice cutting through Sarah's panic. Sarah stopped, her hands hovering over her daughter, looking at Caleb with wide, pleading eyes. Caleb stood up, the movement fluid and commanding, and walked around the table. He picked up the red folder from Rocco and the white folder from Vance. He placed them both on the carpet, 3 feet apart, directly in front of the baby. We're at a stalemate, Caleb announced, looking at his lieutenants who were watching him as if he had lost his mind. Rocco wants blood. Vance wants the future. I say we let instinct decide. He looked down at Daisy, who was busy trying to eat her own fist. Choose, kid, Caleb said, his tone serious as a heart attack. Red or white. War or peace. The room went dead silent. Rocco looked like he was about to have a stroke. You're joking, boss, Rocco hissed. You're letting a diaper filler decide the fate of $100 million? Instinct never lies, Rocco, Caleb replied coldly. Watch. Daisy looked at the 2 folders. The red one was glossy, bright, attractive. The white one was plain, boring stock paper. She crawled forward, her knees thumping softly on the expensive carpet. She paused at the red folder, reaching out a chubby hand. Rocco grinned, a triumphant, ugly look. But then Daisy wrinkled her nose, made a face like she smelled something bad, and swatted the red folder away. She crawled past it, plunked her diapered bottom squarely onto the white folder, picked up the corner, and began to chew on it enthusiastically. There's your answer, Caleb said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Plan A. We go legitimate. He picked up the slobber-covered white folder and tossed it to Vance. Make it happen. The room erupted in murmurs, half relieved, half shocked. But Rocco stood frozen, his face turning a shade of purple that matched the rejected folder. He had been humiliated, not just beaten, but dismissed by a baby. He looked at Caleb, and the hatred in his eyes was no longer hidden. It was open, raw, and lethal. You're making a mistake, Rocco spat, gathering his files with trembling hands. You're letting a woman and a kid turn you into a weak old man. I'm making a future, Caleb corrected, his voice dropping to a warning. Get on board, Rocco. Or get off the ship. Rocco didn't answer. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard the glass rattled. As he passed Nina in the hallway, their eyes met. No words were exchanged, but the message passed between them was clear as crystal. The king was weak. The king was distracted. And it was time for the king to fall. The peace of the morning didn't last long because peace in Caleb Vance's world was just a pause between rounds of violence. 2 hours after the boardroom emptied, the service elevator dinged with a sound that usually meant laundry delivery, but today it brought something much heavier. Big Mike dragged a man down the hallway, a low-level runner from the shipping docks named Benny, who had been seen flashing too much cash at a local bar. Benny's feet scraped uselessly against the marble, his mouth duct-taped shut, his eyes wide white orbs of terror. Sarah was in the hallway, pushing a cart of fresh linens toward the guest room, humming a soft lullaby to Daisy, who was strapped to her chest. She stopped dead when she saw them. Mike didn't even look at her, just kicked open the door to the heavy oak study next to Caleb's office and threw the man inside like a bag of trash. Caleb was already there, leaning against the edge of his desk, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up to reveal the tattoos on his forearms that most people never live to see. The door didn't close all the way. It stayed cracked just an inch, a sliver of darkness leaking out into the light of Sarah's world. Sarah should have walked away, should have run back to the safety of the kitchen or the nursery, but her feet were nailed to the floor by the sound of Caleb's voice. It wasn't the voice of the man who had laughed at spinach on his suit or the man who had let a baby decide his business strategy. It was the voice of the ghost. "You sold the warehouse schedule for $5,000, Benny," Caleb said, his tone conversational, bored even. $5,000. That's the price of my reputation. Muffled sounds of denial came from the room, the thump of a body hitting a chair. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was afraid it would wake Daisy. Then came the order, delivered with zero emotion, cold as liquid nitrogen. "He's not talking, Mike. Start with the pinky. Remove a finger every hour until he gives us a name. And Mike, use the rusty pliers. Infection sends a better message." The words hit Sarah like a physical slap. Remove a finger. Rusty pliers. This wasn't a business. This was a slaughterhouse. The man she had started to trust, the man she had started to see as a protector, was a monster who ordered torture before lunch. The scream that followed was muffled by the tape, but Sarah heard it in her soul. She spun around, the cart abandoned in the middle of the hallway, and ran. She didn't run to the kitchen or the laundry room. She ran straight to the small servants' quarters at the back of the estate, the only place that felt remotely like hers. She burst inside, slamming the door and sliding the heavy deadbolt home with trembling hands. She collapsed onto the narrow bed, clutching Daisy so tight the baby let out a squeak of protest. Sarah's breath came in jagged gasps, her mind replaying the sound of that cold, detached voice over and over again. She had let her guard down. She had let herself believe that because he was kind to Daisy, he was a good man. But he wasn't. He was a predator who played house when it suited him and tore people apart when it didn't. She looked at the door, realizing that the lock was a joke. If Caleb Vance wanted to come in, he would come in. If he wanted to hurt them, no piece of wood would stop him. She was trapped in a castle with a dragon, and for the first time since she arrived, she wasn't afraid of the outside world. She was afraid of the man sleeping down the hall. The next morning, the silence in the penthouse was louder than a gunshot. Sarah moved through the rooms like a shadow, eyes cast down, shoulders hunched in a permanent flinch. She cleaned the office while Caleb was on a call, but she didn't hum, she didn't speak, and she didn't look at him. Caleb finished his call and stood up, walking toward where Sarah was dusting the bookshelf with Daisy in a carrier on her back. "Sarah," he said, his voice dropping to that softer register he saved for them. He reached out a hand to tickle Daisy's foot, a gesture that had become their morning ritual. Sarah gasped and jerked back, spinning away from him as if his hand were made of fire. Her eyes were wide, filled not just with fear, but with horror. She looked at his hand, the hand that had ordered a man's mutilation, and then she looked at his face with an expression that cut deeper than any knife. She didn't see the father figure. She saw the butcher. Caleb froze, his hand suspended in empty air, the rejection stinging worse than the time he'd been shot in the shoulder. He slowly lowered his hand, his jaw tightening as the realization washed over him. He could buy loyalty. He could force obedience. He could command fear. But respect? Respect was gone. And looking at the terrified woman shielding her child from him, Caleb Vance realized that for the first time in his life, being the ghost felt less like power and more like a curse. Caleb Vance stood in the doorway of the nursery, like a dark sentinel, blocking Sarah's escape with a presence that sucked the oxygen right out of the room. It was late, the estate wrapped in a silence that felt more like a held breath than peace, and Sarah hugged the laundry basket to her chest as if it were a shield against a bullet. She tried to step around him, keeping her eyes fixed on the floor, but Caleb moved with that terrifying grace of his, placing a hand on the doorframe to bar her way. "You're shaking," he said, his voice low and devoid of the warmth that had been there just days ago. "Every time I walk into a room, you look for the exit. Stop it." Sarah finally looked up, her green eyes wide and wet, flashing with a sudden, reckless anger born of pure exhaustion. "I look for the exit because I know what you do," she whispered, the memory of the torture room screaming in her head. "I know about the pliers. I know about the fingers. You're not a businessman, Caleb. You're a butcher." Caleb didn't flinch, didn't deny it, didn't offer a single excuse for the violence that was etched into his soul. He stepped closer, crowding her space until she could smell the expensive whiskey and gunpowder clinging to his skin. "I am a monster," he admitted, the truth hanging between them like a blade. "I break men. I burn worlds. That is how I keep the wolves from the door. But hear me, Sarah. I would burn this entire city to ash before I let a single spark touch you or that baby. You are safe. Not because I am good, but because I am the most dangerous thing in the dark." He let her pass then, but the promise didn't stop Sarah's hands from trembling as she fled to the basement archives an hour later. She needed to be as far away from him as possible, burying herself in the one place even the ghost rarely visited. The archives were a tomb of paper and dust, rows of metal shelves stretching back into the gloom, filled with the dead records of a criminal empire. Sarah pushed her cleaning cart slowly, the wheels squeaking on the concrete floor, the smell of old paper choking her. She was supposed to be shredding old manifests, a mindless task to drown out her fear, but a voice cut through the hum of the ventilation system. It was sharp, hushed, and coming from the secure server room at the far end of the aisle. Sarah froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was Nina. The secretary never came down here, never sullied her designer heels with basement dust. Sarah crept forward, extinguishing her flashlight, moving with the silent invisibility of a woman who had spent her life trying not to be seen. She pressed herself against a stack of bankers' boxes, peering through the gap between the shelves. Nina was standing by the server rack, the blue light of the terminals washing over her face, turning her into a ghoulish figure. She held a burner phone to her ear, her voice dripping with a malice that made Sarah's blood turn to ice. "The timeline has moved up," Nina hissed into the phone, her eyes darting around the shadows. "He's distracted. The baby has made him soft, Rocco. He hesitated on the Falcone strike. The men smell blood." Sarah clamped a hand over her mouth, her breath hitching. "Rocco." Nina was talking to the traitor who had stormed out of the boardroom, the man who wanted war. "Tomorrow night," Nina continued, checking her watch. "During the transfer, the Falcones hit the convoy, and we take out the ghost from the inside. Make it look like a firefight." Silence stretched for a second as she listened to the voice on the other end, and then a cruel smile twisted her red lips. "Don't worry about loose ends. The cleaner and the brat are here. I'll handle them myself." A tragic fire in the servants' quarters. No one will look twice at a dead maid and an orphan. The world tilted on its axis for Sarah. It wasn't just a coup. It was an execution. They were going to kill Caleb, and then they were going to burn her and Daisy alive. The sheer horror of it made her knees buckle, and her elbow knocked against a metal shelf. Cling. The sound was deafening in the quiet basement, echoing like a gunshot. Nina spun around instantly, the burner phone snapping shut, her hand diving into her purse. Sarah scrambled back, trying to run, but her foot caught on the cleaning cart and she stumbled. Before she could regain her balance, Nina was there. She didn't pull a gun. She didn't scream. She simply stepped out of the shadows, looking immaculate and terrifying, blocking the only exit. Sarah pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, trapped. Nina looked her up and down, a look of pure contempt, as if Sarah were a cockroach she hadn't gotten around to crushing it. "You really shouldn't be down here, Sarah," Nina said, her voice smooth as silk and cold as a grave. "It's dangerous in the dark. People get hurt." Sarah couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. Nina stepped closer, invading her personal space, her perfume cloying and sweet. She reached out and tucked a stray lock of hair behind Sarah's ear, a gesture that was mocking and intimate and terrifying. "You know," Nina whispered, leaning in so close her lips brushed Sarah's ear. "Accidents happen to curious girls. Brakes fail. Cars crash. Husbands die. It would be a shame if history repeated itself, wouldn't it?" She pulled back, smiling that shark-like smile, and turned on her heel. "Go to bed, Sarah. While you still can." Nina walked away, the click-clack of her heels fading into the darkness, leaving Sarah sliding down the wall to the floor, paralyzed by the realization that the woman who had helped kill her husband was now standing in the hallway of her home, holding the match that would burn them all. 2 a.m. was the hour of ghosts, and Sarah Miller was walking through a hallway of shadows to wake the most dangerous one of them all. Her bare feet made no sound on the plush carpet, but her heart was beating so hard she was sure it echoed off the marble walls. She reached the heavy double doors of the master suite, her hand hovering over the handle, trembling uncontrollably. Opening this door could get her shot, but staying in her room meant waiting to be burned alive. She took a breath that tasted like panic, pushed the handle down, and slipped inside. The room was pitch black, smelling of cedar and gun oil, and before she could take 2 steps, the click of a hammer cocking back froze the blood in her veins. "Give me one reason." Caleb's voice came from the darkness, rough with sleep but sharp as a razor. "One reason why I shouldn't put a bullet in the silhouette standing by my door." Sarah didn't move, didn't breathe, knowing that the barrel of a Sig Sauer was pointed directly at her chest. "It's me," she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's Sarah. They're going to kill you, Caleb. They're going to kill us all." The lamp on the bedside table flicked on, blinding her for a second, and when her eyes adjusted, she saw Caleb sitting up, the gun already lowered, but his muscles coiled tight as a spring. He looked at her, taking in her pale face, her shaking hands, the sheer terror radiating off her in waves. "Talk," he commanded, swinging his legs out of bed, fully dressed in sleeping pants, but reaching for a shirt. Sarah spelled everything, the words tumbling out over each other in a frantic rush. She told him about the basement. She told him about Nina's voice, the burner phone, the mention of the timeline moving up. She told him about Rocco and the plan to hit the convoy. And then, choking back a sob, she told him the part that had sent her running to his room. "Nina said the cleaner and the brat," Sarah cried, tears finally spilling over. "She said she'd handle us herself." A tragic fire in the servants' quarters. "She called Daisy a brat, Caleb. She's going to burn my baby." Caleb went perfectly still, his motion of buttoning his shirt pausing midway. The air in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He just sat there, and the look in his eyes changed from shock to a darkness so profound it looked like the abyss itself. Caleb stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the grounds that were no longer a sanctuary, but a hunting ground. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his mind with the force of a train wreck. Nina knew the financials. Rocco provided the muscle. It wasn't just about the Falcone takeover, it was about the past. Ironclad logistics, Caleb said softly, turning back to look at Sarah. The shell company your husband found. Nina managed those accounts. Rocco was the one I sent to clean up loose ends in Gary that week. The realization hit him like a physical blow to the gut. He hadn't just been blind to the treason in his own house, he had been the weapon they used. I didn't order the hit on your husband, Caleb said, his voice rough with a sudden, terrible clarity. But my people did. Mina sold him out to the Falcones to cover her skimming, and Rocco enforced it to keep her happy. They used my name to kill a good man. Sarah stared at him, the horror of the truth mixing with the relief that he finally understood. The monsters who had destroyed her life were the same ones sleeping under his roof. He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping inches from her, the energy radiating off him making her skin prickle. He didn't touch her, not yet, but the intensity of his gaze held her up better than any embrace could. I have been asleep, Caleb whispered, looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a victim, but as the woman who had walked into the fire to wake him up. I let them get comfortable. I let them think I was weak. He reached out then, his hand covering hers, his palm warm and calloused, a solid anchor in the storm. You saved my life tonight, Sarah. Now watch me save yours. He turned away, grabbing his shoulder holster from the nightstand and strapping it on with a fluid, practiced motion. The ghost was back, but this time, he wasn't fighting for territory or money. He was fighting for the trembling woman standing in his bedroom and the baby sleeping down the hall. Go back to your room, Caleb ordered, checking the magazine of his gun. Lock the door. Put the dresser in front of it. Do not open it for anyone but me. He paused at the door, looking back one last time. They wanted a fire, he said, his voice cold as death. I'm going to give them an inferno. Caleb moved through the darkened hallway like smoke, his target the office where the evidence of Rocco's betrayal lay hidden in the safe. He pushed open the heavy oak door expecting silence, but instead, a shadow detached itself from the corner behind the curtains. It was a professional hitman dressed in black, a serrated combat knife gleaming in the moonlight. The assassin lunged before Caleb could raise his gun, the blade slashing through the air with a deadly hiss. Caleb blocked the strike with his forearm, the impact jarring his bones, and drove his knee into the attacker's gut. They crashed onto the expensive Persian rug, a tangle of limbs and grunts, the knife inching closer to Caleb's throat. Caleb didn't panic because panic was for men who wanted to die. He twisted his body, trapping the assassin's wrist, but the blade slipped free and sliced deep across his palm, severing skin and muscle. Pain flared like white-hot iron, but it gave him the adrenaline he needed to slam the man's head into the floor leg. Once, twice, until the body went limp. Caleb stood up, breathing hard, blood dripping from his hand onto the documents he had come to save. He was wrapping a towel around his bleeding hand when the door creaked open again, revealing Sarah standing there with Daisy in her arms, her eyes wide with horror at the body on the floor and the blood-soaking Caleb's shirt. Caleb tried to hide the wound, tried to put the mask of the ghost back on, but it was too late. Daisy saw the red stains spreading on his hand, her little face crumpling into a mask of pure distress. She reached out her tiny arms toward him, tears spilling down her cheeks, and her voice rang out clear and heartbreaking in the silence. "Papa hurt," she wailed, the words hitting Caleb harder than the knife ever could. Papa hurt. It was the first time she had ever called him that, a title he hadn't earned and didn't deserve. Caleb froze, the pain in his hand forgotten, replaced by a thundering in his chest that felt like a heart restarting after a long death. He looked at the child who saw him not as a monster, but as a father, and the walls he had built for 20 years began to crumble into dust. Sarah didn't scream or run away this time. Instead, she handed Daisy to him with a trust that terrified him and went to fetch the first aid kit. She led him to the leather sofa, pushing aside the evidence of violence to make room for healing. Her hands were steady as she cleaned the jagged cut with antiseptic, her touch gentle against his battered skin. Caleb watched her, watched the way her brow furrowed in concentration, watched the way she whispered soothing words to Daisy, who was patting his arm. "I'm tired, Sarah," Caleb whispered, the confession tearing out of his throat before he could stop it. "I'm tired of the blood. I'm tired of being the ghost. I built this empire to be safe, but all I did was build a prison." Sarah looked up, her eyes locking with his, and she didn't offer empty platitudes. She finished wrapping the bandage, pulling it tight, and pressed a kiss to his knuckles. "Then tear it down," she said fiercely. "Finish this tonight, Caleb, and come back to us." Caleb nodded, a silent promise passing between them, and stood up to prepare for war. He walked to the adjoining bathroom and washed the blood from his face, staring at the reflection of a man who finally had something to live for. He put on a fresh white shirt, buttoning the cuffs over the bandage, hiding the weakness from the world. He shrugged on a new black suit jacket, the armor of the ghost, but underneath it, he was just a man fighting for his family. He picked up his gun from the desk, checking the chamber one last time, the metallic click echoing in the room. Sarah stood by the door, holding Daisy, not trying to stop him, not begging him to stay. She knew that for peace to exist, the wolves had to be put down. Caleb walked past them, pausing only to brush his thumb against Daisy's cheek. "Lock the door," he ordered, his voice steady. "I'll be back when it's done." He walked out into the hallway, leaving the light behind, stepping into the darkness to burn it all down. The private hangar at O'Hare sat isolated under the wash of sodium floodlights, a cavernous mouth of steel and concrete waiting to swallow the night's secrets. Caleb Vance stood in the center, flanked by Big Mike and a dozen loyal soldiers who melted into the shadows like wraiths, their weapons drawn and ready. He had sent the invitations an hour ago, calling for a celebration of the imminent victory over the Falcones, a lie sweet enough to lure the rats out of their holes. The black SUVs arrived in a convoy, tires crunching on the wet tarmac, carrying Rocco, Nina, and the shivering accountant named Paul. They stepped out wearing smiles that didn't reach their eyes, expecting champagne and promotions, but instead, the hangar doors slammed shut behind them with a booming finality that echoed like a prison sentence. Caleb didn't move, his bandaged hand resting on the grip of his gun, his face a mask of absolute calm. Rocco looked around, his smile faltering as he realized there was no champagne, only men with assault rifles and a boss who looked at him like he was already a corpse. "Where's the party, Caleb?" Rocco asked, his voice echoing in the vast space. "The party's over, Rocco," Caleb replied, his voice flat. "And you're footing the bill." The realization hit them like a physical blow, Nina stumbling back in her heels while Paul began to hyperventilate, clutching his briefcase as if it could save him. Caleb walked forward, tossing his stack of files onto the concrete floor between them, the papers fanning out to reveal bank transfers, phone logs, and the order for the hit on Mark Miller. "I know about the skimming," Caleb said, circling them like a shark. "I know about the deal with the Falcones. I know you sold out my territory for a cut of the synthetic trade." Rocco's face twisted, the fear replaced by an ugly, desperate bravado because he knew there was no way out but through. "You did this," Rocco screamed, spitting on the ground near Caleb's shoes. "You went soft. You let a maid and a brat turn the ghost into a joke. We needed a leader, not a babysitter." He lunged forward, but Big Mike was there instantly, driving the butt of his rifle into Rocco's stomach, sending him to his knees gasping for air. Caleb stepped closer, pulling his gun and pressing the cold steel barrel against Rocco's forehead. "I'm not soft, Rocco," Caleb whispered, his finger tightening on the trigger. "I'm just evolving. But you? You're extinct." The silence in the hangar was deafening, broken only by Nina's sobbing and the metallic click of the hammer pulling back. Caleb looked down at the man he had once called a brother, the man who had ordered the death of Sarah's husband, and he felt the familiar itch to end it, to paint the concrete with betrayal. But then the rear door of the black sedan opened, and Sarah stepped out into the harsh light, ignoring Big Mike's attempt to stop her. She walked across the hangar floor, her footsteps steady, her face pale but resolute, looking completely out of place in this world of violence, yet owning the space entirely. She stopped beside Caleb, placing her hand gently on his arm, right over the tension of his bicep. "Don't," she whispered, her voice cutting through the red haze of his rage. "He deserves it, Caleb. They all do. But Daisy is waiting for you at home." She looked into his eyes, ignoring the gun, ignoring the traitor on his knees. "Don't bring his blood home to her. Don't let her papa be a murderer tonight." Caleb froze, the image of Daisy's smiling face flashing in his mind, warring with the instinct to kill. He looked at Sarah, saw the strength in her mercy, and realized that pulling the trigger would make him the ghost forever, but holstering it would make him a father. Slowly, agonizingly, Caleb lowered the gun, the tension leaving his shoulders as he stepped back from the edge of the abyss. Rocco let out a breath that sounded like a laugh, thinking he had won, thinking the weakness had saved him, but Caleb's next words froze the blood in his veins. "I'm not going to kill you," Caleb said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Death is too easy. Death is peace. And you don't deserve peace." He gestured to Big Mike, who stepped forward to strip them of their phones, their watches, and their keys. "I've emptied your accounts," Caleb continued, watching the color drain from Nina's face. "Every dime you stole, every asset you own, it's gone. Transferred to a charity for victims of gang violence." He leaned down, whispering the final nail into Rocco's coffin. "And I just sent a message to the Falcone brothers. I told them you three were the ones skimming from their cut of the synthetic deal. I told them you were planning to double-cross them too." Rocco's eyes bulged, pure terror flooding his system because he knew what the cartels did to thieves. "You're dead men walking," Caleb said, turning his back on them. "Get out of my city. If you're still in Chicago by sunrise, I won't have to kill you. The Falcones will do it for free." He walked away, taking Sarah's hand, leaving the three traitors shivering in the cold hangar, stripped of their power and left to the mercy of the monsters they had tried to court. It had been a week since the hangar, a week of silence where Sarah tried to convince herself she could go back to being invisible, but the Falcones had a long memory and a petty reach. She came home from a double shift at a diner, her feet aching, to find her key didn't turn in the lock. The landlord, a man with grease under his fingernails and a sudden nervous sweat, opened the door only to throw her last box of clothes into the mud. "Falcone bought the building," he sneered, refusing to look her in the eye. "No Millers allowed. Clear out." He slammed the door, the sound final as a coffin lid, leaving Sarah standing on the cracked pavement as the sky opened up. The rain began to fall, cold Chicago rain that soaked through her thin coat in seconds, turning the dust of her life into mud. Sarah stood there, staring at her meager belongings scattered on the sidewalk, a broken lamp, a bag of diapers, a framed photo of Mark shattered by the impact. She had survived torture rooms and gunfights. She had faced down killers and saved a crime lord, but this mundane cruelty broke her knees. She sank to the curb, pulling the plastic cover over Daisy's stroller, shielding the only thing that mattered while the water ruined everything else. Her phone burned in her pocket, the screen cracked but functional, Caleb's private number saved at the top. One call, and he would burn this building to the ground. One call, and the ghost would materialize to turn this landlord into a memory. But she didn't dial. She couldn't. He had spared the traitors for her, changed his empire for her, stripped his life down to the studs to be a better man, and she refused to be the anchor dragging him back into the violence. "We're okay, baby," she whispered to Daisy, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "Mommy will figure it out." But she had $12 to her name and no roof. The streetlights flickered on, buzzing like angry hornets, illuminating a woman who had saved a king but couldn't save herself. She pulled her knees to her chest, the cold seeping into her bones, waiting for a miracle she didn't believe in anymore. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythm of the rain, resigned to the darkness, wondering if this was how it ended, not with a bang, but with a shivering whimper in the gutter. Then the darkness shattered. Tires screeched against the wet asphalt, a sound of aggression that made Sarah look up. 3 black SUVs tore around the corner, mounting the curb and boxing her in like a presidential motorcade, the headlights blinding her. The doors flew open before the wheels even stopped rolling. Caleb Vance stepped out into the downpour, wearing a tuxedo that cost more than the building behind her, ignoring the mud splashing onto his polished shoes. He didn't look like the ghost tonight. He looked like a man who had stopped breathing hours ago. He scanned the street, wild-eyed, spotting her huddled form, and the relief that crossed his face was so raw it hurt to watch. He stormed toward her, ripping his jacket off to throw it over her shivering shoulders, not caring that his silk shirt was instantly soaked. "Why didn't you call?" he roared, his voice cracking with a fury born of terror. "I tore the city apart looking for you. I thought they took you. I thought I lost you." He fell to his knees in the mud, grabbing her face with both hands, forcing her to look at him. "Why, Sarah? Why would you sit in the rain when you have a home?" "I'm nobody," Sarah sobbed, the fight finally draining out of her as the warmth of his hands seeped into her skin. "I'm just the cleaner. I didn't want to be a burden." Caleb looked at her as if she were insane, shaking his head violently. "You're not the cleaner," he said, his voice fierce and low, drowning out the storm. "You saved my soul, Sarah. You are the only thing in this world that is real." He stood up, scooping Daisy out of the stroller with one arm and pulling Sarah up with the other. He held them both against his chest, shielding them from the world, an impenetrable wall of muscle and will. "No more running," he commanded, pressing his forehead against hers, rain dripping from his nose. "You are my family. This city belongs to us, and no one kicks my family out into the cold." He kissed her then, a desperate, claiming kiss that tasted of rain and promise. It wasn't a movie kiss, it was a seal on a contract written in blood and survival. Daisy, safe and warm between them, clapped her chubby hands. "Papa home," she chirped, her voice clear as a bell. Caleb pulled back, looking down at the child who had started it all, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Yeah, kid," he whispered, holding them tighter. "Papa's home." 2 years had passed since the night in the hangar, and the Vance estate no longer smelled of gun oil and fear, but of maple syrup and fabric softener. The penthouse that had once been a fortress for the ghost was now a playground for a 3-year-old who rolled with an iron fist wrapped in sticky fingers. Caleb sat at the kitchen island, not reviewing hit lists, but reading the Wall Street Journal while trying to dodge a flying piece of pancake thrown by Daisy. Sarah sat across from him, highlighting a thick textbook on business ethics, her hair messy and her smile brighter than the diamond ring on her finger. It was a chaotic, loud, messy morning, the kind of ordinary life Caleb used to despise, but now it was the only thing he would kill to protect. He looked at his wife and daughter, realizing that the silence he had once craved was actually a tomb, and this noise was the sound of being alive. The Vance Corporation was now the leading logistics firm in the Midwest, legitimate and clean, and the legend of the ghost was fading into a whisper, replaced by the reality of a man who wiped sticky hands and read bedtime stories. The drive to the preschool wasn't an armored convoy, just a black SUV with a car seat in the back and a nervous former crime lord behind the wheel. Caleb adjusted his tie in the rearview mirror, sweating more than he ever had before a sit-down with the cartel because today wasn't about turf wars, it was about first impressions. "Do I look okay?" he asked for the 3rd time, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. Sarah laughed, reaching over to squeeze his hand, the one that still bore the faint white scar from the night he chose them over the darkness. "You look like a dad, Caleb," she said softly, her eyes full of the love that had healed him. "You look like a hero." He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding, realizing that the title of Papa carried more weight and terror than the ghost ever did. He wasn't afraid of bullets anymore, but the thought of the other dads judging his daughter terrified him. They walked toward the school gates, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet, a stark contrast to the broken glass and concrete of his past. Daisy skipped between them, holding both their hands, swinging them back and forth with the carefree joy of a child who had never known the monsters her father had slain to get her here. Other parents were there, normal people with normal jobs, and for the first time in 44 years, Caleb Vance didn't scan the perimeter for threats or check the rooftops for snipers. He just watched his daughter run toward the playground, her laughter ringing out like a church bell, and felt the heavy coat of his past finally slip off his shoulders. He had traded an empire of fear for a kingdom of peace, and standing there in the sunlight with the woman who saved him, he knew he had won the only war that mattered. He wasn't the ghost anymore. He was just Caleb, and that was enough. Caleb's story reminds us that no one is too broken to be fixed, and no soul is too dark to find the light. It teaches us that family isn't always about whose blood runs in your veins, but about who is willing to bleed for you when the world turns its back. We often think that strength means never showing weakness, but Sarah showed us that true strength is the courage to be vulnerable and the bravery to forgive. Thank you for taking this journey with us on Sunni Romance, where we believe that love is the only force powerful enough to rewrite destiny. What about you? Do you believe that a person can truly change their nature for love, or are we forever bound by our pasts? Let us know in the comments below because your stories inspire us every day.